is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'd like to refer members to my entry in the Register of Members' Interest. I also have been able to visit Egypt and inform myself of what's been going on and currently going on there. And at this point, I'd very much like to associate myself and echo the concerns that honourable members have expressed over the tragic fate of Giulia Regani and other human rights abuses. And I will go on to talk about this more later in my speech. Recent events in Egypt have fundamentally disturbed and challenged us to think about other dynamics underlying the Arab Spring, posing basic questions to Western politicians, which have been played out in Egypt on a global stage. In many ways, events in Egypt can fundamentally challenge our sometimes lazy notions of democracy, and also challenge us to consider the realities of that balance and tensions between freedoms and the merits of stability. We should not underestimate the uniqueness of Egypt's position. If you look at its neighbours, which also experienced that tidal wave of the Arab Spring in 2011, if we look at Syria, we've got that horrific, blood-stained chaos which is suckling the diabolical death culture of Daesh. It's a humanitarian catastrophe, the effects of which are not only causing untold numbers of inhumane acts of cruelty against individuals, children, homosexuals, but is destabilising the whole of Europe and, in fact, is a centre of global tensions. Look at Yemen, sunk beneath a flood of war, and Iraq, struggling against the onslaught of Daesh, and Libya, Egypt's neighbour, now a failed state, and it's an arena of warring militias and jihadists. These are Egypt's neighbours, and I think it's very important that we consider Egypt's actions and challenges in that context. And then by contrast, if you look at Egypt, in 2011 there was an uprising. Mubarak was removed in February. June 2012, Egypt held elections. Morsi was elected. Then the country became dramatically alarmed at the direction Morsi began taking, including many of those who thought the Muslim Brotherhood would prove genuinely moderate. And then from January to the summer of 2013, public protest reached boiling point. 30th of June 2013, Morsi's removed, and in May 2014, after some constitutional preparations and changes, General el-Sisi, who was a Muslim appointed by Morsi, is elected as president to serve as a Muslim who wants state. Now, at the time, the West described this as undemocratic, and I think this is one of those examples where we should perhaps step back, take a little reality check and just consider what our priorities are and where our judgments should lie. Reports from a very close friend of mine who's half Egyptian from his Copt family in Alexandria and Cairo reported the detail of the mortal fear that Copts rapidly grew under as members of their congregation began to disappear and churches were attacked. The culture of fear under Morsi escalated very, very, very quickly and very alarmingly. And anecdotally, Muslims in Egypt have told me that they too began to be very frightened when they found that the Muslim Brotherhood did not seem to be to them what it had initially said on the tin. They became alarmed at Morsi's attempt to constitutionally make himself unchallengeable. Now, we can all think of a great leader, perhaps not so great in what he did in the last century, whose first challenge to Europe was to make himself constitutionally unchallengeable. And in that growing fear of alarm and oppression, Egypt simply rejected the path to political Islam, that it was being hurled, brute force hurled down. Now, we have to remember that democracy wasn't going to happen like it does in Tunbridge Wells. To think that it would, I'm afraid, is to demonstrate, I fear, the naivety that the West sometimes has in imposing its standards and its structures, which took our country several hundred years of bloody war to establish, on other countries and then become judgmental. And so, in travelling around Egypt, what are the results of this process that Britain called undemocratic? I was very lucky to be at the opening of the new Suez Canal expansion, which was achieved in under a year, necessary but obviously far from sufficient in aiding the Egyptian economy to stabilise and thrive. And anecdotally, from what I saw and observed in the city of Cairo, I found nothing but tangible relief that someone had at last taken control of a country that people felt was teetering into oblivion. And actually, to my surprise, that was coming from very conservative Muslims as well. And that's echoed in my travels talking to mothers, students, taxi drivers, that there's a fundamental sense of relief. Yes, apprehension for the future, but fundamental relief that Egypt is finally under some kind of control. And ironically, although not democratically elected, as the West perhaps would have liked it to have taken place, Sisi, as far as we can tell, enjoys a popularity that I think many elected leaders in this country would do a lot for.
Will the Honourable...
I would be happy to.
I mean, just as as far as Sisi is concerned, he was democratically elected. I mean, some of the returns were impressive. I think it was something like 90% of the vote or 95%, but there was a democratic process.
Thank you very much to my honourable friend for clarifying that. There was, of course, a democratic process after considerable institutional and constitutional preparations had been made for this transition, which, given the context, I think, was quite remarkable, particularly when you compare that process to the fates of other countries surrounding Egypt. I was referring to the fact that many people didn't want Morsi to be removed and wanted Morsi to hang on and then elections to take place. From the anecdotes, and it is only anecdotes, I've meant that, but from what I'd seen of people living in Egypt, the idea that elections would take place in a free and fair way under that culture of fear was optimistic, I think, at best. However, I don't want anyone to think that I'm describing a situation that is rosy. It is very far from roses. The younger population, in my experience, are very concerned, and those concerns, interestingly, chime very much with our concerns about human rights abuses and clampdowns that we've heard echoed here today. The imprisoning of journalists, the appalling treatment, the tragic and diabolical treatment of the Italian Cambridge student, and I hope I don't have to take up valuable time in expressing how abominable that is. Other honourable members have done that far better, perhaps, than I might be able to. But interestingly, the students and the younger population said that this was not only abominable, but actually politically unnecessary, that Sisi enjoyed sufficient popularity that he didn't need to clamp down in this heavy-handed way. Which brings me on to my next point, that such human rights abuses are not only fundamentally morally wrong, they are also dangerous for the country itself. Human rights abuses foster the kind of radicalism and extremism and takfiri thinking that Egypt is fundamentally pitched against. If we look at where radicals like Ayaan al-Zawahiri come from, we see the very detrimental effect that prison torture plays on radicalising either budding extremists or existing extremists. And if we think we have an incentive to crush extremism, look at Egypt's neighbours, and you can see just how urgent that crushing of extremist takfiri mentality is to them. So how can Egypt become more successful in eradicating that extremism? The impression I've had is that, like many countries that are facing a modernisation and perhaps a modernised younger generation, there's a counterintuitive paradox of gripping less tightly in order to be stronger. We had the very great privilege and very interesting experience of meeting many members of Parliament of the nascent Parliament. Now, I remember the confusion that this Parliament was undergoing, a great institution, when we had for the first time a coalition Parliament in 2010, and everyone ran around not quite knowing what was going on. Imagine a completely new Parliament, a set of 200 or so pieces of legislation which had to be reviewed in a short space of time, and the establishment of much of the constitutions that we take for granted here. This is a Parliament that is really trying to get off the ground, and it would seem bizarre if Britain, which has such an established Parliament, were not to take a forerunning lead in helping and nurturing that fledgling to fly and become the solid institution that is so important in forming a politically stable Egypt. It's a brave, resilient country in that sense, trying to form a bastion of democracy against a sea of hostility surrounding it. There are also deep concerns over Egypt's economy. With oil prices falling, support in the Gulf is waning. That's concerning. And in order to move to a more healthy economy, Sisi has a very difficult balancing act to achieve, weaning the country off subsidies and at the same time avoiding the public protest which would emerge and destabilise Egypt were prices of bread to go up on the street. Egypt's economy is based on around 10 to 15% of the economy as tourism, and around 1 to 5% of that tourism is from Britain. If we want Egypt to remain stable and flourish, we do need to get Sharm el-Sheikh flights back as soon as we possibly can, and the work must be concluded quickly. And in assessing the security of resuming flights to Sharm el-Sheikh, obviously we must put the safety of our citizens first, but we should also consider the security implications of not resuming those flights. There are an awful lot of Egyptian people who are dependent on tourism. If those people